All right, I see the participants queue filling up. So let me take that opportunity and to start by welcoming everyone joining this webinar today. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the American German Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And we are really delighted to present this webinar today with three excellent panelists on US and German relations with Russia. Let me give you a quick rundown of who we have with us today. First of all, we have Dr. Liana Fix, who is a fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations here in Washington, D.C., but she has worked at the Kerber Foundation in Berlin, at the Robert Bosch Foundation, and at two of Germany's leading foreign policy research organizations, the SWP and the DGAP. She was also a DAAD AGI fellow here with us in Washington, for which we hold her in, of course, special regard. And she's a prolific author on Russia, foreign relations, and international affairs more broadly. We have Alexander Sasha Gabuev, who is the director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, based in Berlin. He was earlier in his career a journalist and has taught in Moscow and in Shanghai, and is also a quite prolific author. You will find his work not only in the most recent on the Foreign Affairs website, but also recently in the New York Times. And Eric Green, until 2023, was a member of the United States Foreign Service, and he was the senior director for Russia and Central Asia at the National Security Council. He has been director of the Office of Russian Affairs in the State Department and served as head of the political section at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, among many other important assignments. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for being with us today. And let me just give a very brief introduction, and then we will get started. First of all, this is a webinar about policy toward Russia from Germany and the United States. Of course, the issue of Russia's invasion of Ukraine suffuses everything that has to do with Russia policy, but it is not the only factor in our relations with Russia. And so we want to take some time today to illuminate all of those important aspects. So we will be talking, of course, about Ukraine, but it is not the central focus of today's webinar. I think it's as we see, there are certainly lately with respect to Ukraine, we have June 15, 16 peace summit in Switzerland. We've had another round of secondary sanctions by the United States. There has been the G7 loan arrangement with Ukraine, which seeks to make use of the frozen Russian assets. And we are just around the corner from a NATO summit where Ukraine will factor significantly in the discussions. At the same time, Russia's reliance on Iran and North Korea for support in the war against Ukraine has meant that Moscow is increasingly aligned with Tehran and with North Korea. We see this just this week in Russian President Putin's visit to North Korea and the conclusion of a strategic partnership agreement, the exact scope of which I think people are still seeking to understand. At the same time that the United States and Germany and on the governmental level have been very supportive of Ukraine and taking an increasingly tough line toward Russia, there are also some dissenting voices, not only from the far right and far left in Germany, which have regularly echoed Russian views on the war in Ukraine and on the need for a different approach to Russia, but also from some of the mainstream parties. The caucus leader of the Social Democratic Party in the German Bundestag recently talked about the need to freeze, was his word, freeze the conflict as a step to ending it. Some people interpret that as an indicator that the German Social Democrats and Chancellor Scholz in the campaign for next year's election will increasingly emphasize the so-called peace card. So we will talk a little bit about that today, perhaps as well. And naturally, in the United States, we have great uncertainty around the U.S. presidential election and the election of a new House and a third of the Senate, and what that will mean for U.S. policy toward Russia. You can at best find only ambiguous lines coming from the Trump campaign. On the one hand, he's talked about President Zelensky of Ukraine as the greatest salesman in the world and criticized the aid that Washington has given him. On the other hand, you can read in the current edition of Foreign Affairs, former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien's argument that a Trump presidency, if he were reelected, would continue lethal assistance to Ukraine. So ambiguous at best. So with that, I want to get started, and I'm going to start with Eric Green. Because Eric, until just a few months ago, you were in one of the most important policymaking positions for U.S. policy toward Russia, and identified as sort of the most direct threat, the most immediate threat to U.S. interests. Is U.S. policy toward Russia coterminous with American policy toward Ukraine? In your view? Do we have any other major objectives toward Russia that can even hold with the interest in the Ukraine war?
Yeah, good morning, Jeff, and thanks for the invitation to join this discussion, and greetings to Sasha and Liana. It's great to be with you guys. I think the short, glib answer to your question is it is all about Ukraine, and I'd say during my time at the NSC, which was kind of from the beginning of the administration, so January 2021 through to a little over a year ago, the Ukraine question kind of increasingly came to dominate how we thought about and what we did with Russia. So at the beginning, we had the idea of creating this predictable, stable relationship with Russia, where we didn't call it a reset. We recognized that there were going to be serious limitations to the relationship, but we thought there could be opportunities to engage with Moscow on things like climate, regional issues, one of which was Ukraine. We were involved in the whole Minsk process at that time. As the threat of Russia's invasion sort of intensified over the course of 2021, starting in the fall, and we realized the magnitude of what Russia was contemplating, we became, increasingly alarmed, and we, for reasons I'll talk about, we came to see this threat that Russia was posing to Ukraine as far bigger than our relationship with Russia, even bigger than European security. So even before the invasion actually occurred, we were recognizing how tectonic this would be, and we tried to prevent it, of course, and we also tried to rally the allies to ensure that they weren't surprised when it happened, and we used the sharing of intelligence, intensive diplomatic engagement during the months preceding the invasion to that end. But let me unpack back to your question. Is the policy coterminous? And I would say that it largely is, and we can sort of describe that by talking about what are the main U.S. priorities with regard to Ukraine and the war. And one of them is that we want this war to be a strategic failure for Russia. And that gets to the fact that this war is a major turning point for liberal internationalism. and we don't want the end of this war to be represent a situation where Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, benefits from trampling on the core rules of the international order of the UN Charter. And I think before the war, Russia had been kind of chiseling away at the standard and core norms, but with the invasion of Ukraine, they really are posing a frontal challenge to the post 1945 rules. So we want to ensure that Russia does not benefit from this, that those rules are honored and upheld through what happens to Russia during this war. And this is different from saying we want, Russia to be divided and we want regime change in Moscow. That's how Putin is interpreting this phrase, strategic failure. And we can talk about whether there's a better way to describe it. But the overarching point is we want to uphold international rules of the road, and we don't want Russia to benefit from violating them. And then a second priority of the United States is to maintain and strengthen the alliance, and first and foremost, the NATO alliance. Obviously, what Russia is doing is posing, again, a serious challenge to the NATO alliance. And so what we do vis-a-vis Ukraine, we don't want to divide the alliance. And in actuality, the NATO alliance has grown. NATO is seen by the likes of Sweden and Finland as the best insurance policy for their security going forward. So NATO's role has been reinforced through this war, but unfortunately, we still have this problem of the gray areas, including Ukraine and Moldova, that hopefully can be addressed going forward. So, and when we talk about alliances, we've also been pleasantly surprised that for our Asian allies, they've seen that Ukraine is not just a regional event, that it does speak to the importance of deterrence, and it may affect directly China's calculations in Asia, and Sasha, I'm sure, can speak to this as well. And then a third imperative for our policy in the war is to avoid direct conflict with Russia. And this kind of is important to recognize that while our policy in many ways is coterminous with our Russia policy, and Ukraine policies are in many ways coterminous, that does not mean that the Venn diagram between our interests and Ukraine's overlap 100%. And this, of course, has led to criticisms of the United States in terms of how and when and to what extent we're providing assistance to Ukraine, what caveats are placed on them. And it's also led to some instances where you can see some friction, some light between some of the allies in the NATO alliance. But certainly one of President Biden's overarching goals is to not allow that friction to actually divide the alliance and to be as unified as possible. So that I think also explains some of the way that this deliberate escalation has happened within the alliances in terms of how comfortable we are providing certain systems and capabilities to the Ukrainians. And then just finally, a final point on going back to kind of Russia's role as a P5 country. Obviously, Russia is a big player in the international system. We can't avoid that. And on certain issues such as, arms control, we have indicated to Moscow that we are interested in maintaining contacts on strategic stability. Issues like terrorism, we provided Moscow with warning of the recent terrorist attacks in Russia. But I think Moscow's policy very much is all about Ukraine now. So they're keeping us at an arm's length and saying that any discussions with the United States have to include discussions of Ukraine, and we're just not prepared to engage with Moscow if that's a precondition. So I think I'll leave it there.
Pick up on that, Eric. Thank you, because I think that's an important point that we might easily lose sight of if we're talking about our policies toward Russia. You're saying that Russia has also subordinated its foreign policy goals to the war against Ukraine and its imperial ambitions there. So there is sort of a takes two to tango angle to that as well.
Absolutely, and the fact that Putin is signing an agreement with North Korea on mutual defense. I mean, that would never have happened. The visit never would have happened if Moscow's foreign policy wasn't completely subordinated to this, what they regard now as this existential struggle in Ukraine.
And I think it's also a useful reminder to people who might be inclined to chase after the chimera of negotiations that Russia's not interested in offering sort of sweeteners to try to make that happen. So thank you, Eric. Liana, let me turn to you. Of your many pieces that have appeared in Foreign Affairs over the last couple of years, one recent one proposes that the West needs to rebuild a containment approach to Russia. That, of course, has certain implications and requirements with regard to Ukraine and its European integration. But containment would also suggest much more than just support for Ukraine. So what would that look like? What kind of instruments would need to be employed? And we've seen over the course of the Russian war against Ukraine a mixed at best record of countries from, for want of a better term, the global South, and their readiness to support Ukraine. So is that in the power of the West to pursue successfully, in your view?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff, and great to be on this fantastic panel today morning in Washington, D.C. So I think when we wrote this article together in Foreign Affairs with Michael Kimmich, our idea was really, first of all, to contain Russia in Ukraine. And the argument was that back at the time, there were some unrealistic expectations when it came to the war in Ukraine. And I do think this has changed by now a little bit. So the unrealistic expectations were, on the one side, that Ukraine can move towards a battlefield victory despite the lack of success of the counteroffensive, that it's still possible to get Russia out of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea and eastern Ukraine, only through military means. The other side of the unrealistic expectations was that, well, we can just negotiate with Russia and we will find a quick solution, exchange territory for peace or whatever sort of popular proposals there are. And our piece was an attempt to say, well, both of these solutions, which seem sound easy at first, well, you just have a bit of battlefield victory, or you just sort of negotiate an outcome which will be fine with everyone, are not likely anytime in the future. And I think this analysis still holds. We will not see a battlefield victory by Ukraine. And especially with Vladimir Putin's recent remarks before the peace summit in Switzerland, it is pretty clear that his preconditions for a negotiated solution are outrageous and just not to be met by Ukraine. So the solution from our perspective was in this article to say, well, then we need to contain Russia in Ukraine. We need to accept that a battlefield victory will not be around the corner, negotiations neither. So let's try to make sure that Russia cannot advance in Ukraine, that Ukraine can protect its country. It's great to hear that there are news of more patriots coming into Ukraine, that the United States is halting its production for any other orders. So the prioritization of Ukraine's airspace is great news. There has been an expansion of US policy when it comes to using US weapons across Russia's border. So these are all measures that aim, including a broadened sanctions regime on Russia, that aim at sort of containing Russia's actions in Ukraine. But the other aspect that I think we have not yet foreseen at the beginning of the war, to what extent containment, as you said, Jeff, is also necessary on a global scale. Because what certainly came unexpected is the extent of cooperation, and you already talked with Eric about this, the extent of sort of cooperation that Russia is pursuing with other countries, North Korea, but most importantly with China, to continue and sustain this war. So if one thinks this through, the question in the end is, if we want to contain Russia in Ukraine, do we have to contain Russia's relationships with China and the support that Russia gets from China? And Sasha will be able to talk more about it, the support that it gets from North Korea, and how can we do this? And I do think the greatest trade-off, especially from the perspective of Europeans, is the question of, where do we prioritize China's support for Russia in dual-use goods, but still immense quantity and quality, so that we don't end up in a situation where sort of on the one side, Europeans and Americans are sort of pouring money into Ukraine to help it sustain in this war, but these efforts are kind of neutralized from the other side with China's support for Russia, while at the same time, Europeans and obviously also still US Americans are pursuing trade and prosperous economic relations with China. So that is a dilemma that comes with the question of how can we contain Russia in Ukraine when Russia has sort of globalized its the resources that it gets for this war. And shifting a little bit to the Germany question that you have posed at the beginning of the seminar, Jeff, I do think this question is particularly difficult for Germany because Germany has abandoned all past illusions on Russia. So you will find no one who still talks about, change through trade. Even you mentioned, this narrative about peace. Obviously, on the left and the far right and far left, you have people supporting this argument who are mostly pursuing a nationalistic camp. But I would not even say that the Social Democrats making a campaign with peace is necessarily indicating that they're kind of becoming wobbly. I think it's just in general difficult to make a campaign which says, well, let's get ready for war. I mean, that's sort of that's something which kind of scares people just inherently. And it's also important not to let peace become a term which is just dominated by the left wing and by the right wing camp, right? I mean, we should keep the term peace for us, but we should make clear what we mean by peace, namely a just peace and not a surrender peace as sort of the other side's demand. So I think it's fair to keep sort of the term peace in the debate, and it does not necessarily indicate that the center parties in Germany are becoming wobbly. But the real test for Germany, probably not this year, but next year, will be how will they react if China's support for Russia continues. At the moment, many Europeans are still trying to look away. But that is going to be a fundamental challenge because in the German discourse, and Sasha being at least very often in Berlin, sitting in Berlin, can talk more about this. Much of the rhetoric about Russia has remained in place with China, about we need to work together with China and so on. So while Germany's Russia policy has changed, the principles underlying sort of past Germany's Russia policy, the principles themselves have not fully disappeared. Sort of the old ideas of, if we just work closely together, we can prevent escalation and so on. they have shifted to other areas, and especially to China. And I think that's going to be a dilemma. I don't have any concerns about Germany becoming wobbly on Russia. I mean, therefore, Russia is just way too aggressive with anything it does in Ukraine and beyond. But seeing this interlinkages of this global interlinkages of Russia's war and addressing those, I see that as particularly challenging for Germany.
Okay. Thank you, Liana. A note to our viewers, we will get to Q&A in a little bit, so I encourage you to think about questions you want to pose to our panelists. I encourage you to make the questions concise and to make them a question, please. I'll be collecting and posing those in a few minutes. But before we do that, I want to turn to you, Sasha. You've got a piece up on the Foreign Affairs website just a couple of days ago, which is titled "Why China is Sabotaging Ukraine." Maybe we'll come to some of those aspects. But the thing that really sparked my interest was a piece you wrote in the New York Times last month, which was titled "The West Doesn't Understand How Much Russia Has Changed." And I think you make the argument there that never in its history has Russia been as entwined with China as it is now, economically, politically, but also in broader terms. I think there have been many in the West, and including in the United States, who have felt there is some kind of inherent limit on the potential closeness between Russia and China because of their own past disagreements, their long border, and Russia's aversion to being dominated by a much larger, more prosperous, and more dynamic neighbor. But you seem to be coming to the opposite conclusion. And I think you make the point that it may be wishful thinking to assume that Russia might, for its own reasons, want to pursue a more European orientation in the future. What are the implications of that for Russia from your perspective?
Well, that future is not set. I think that we are in a very dynamic and unpredictable moment at the battlefield and in this war. We might be at a certain inflection point. Russia doesn't appear to have material resources to run over Ukraine. Like, it has important incremental gains on the battlefield, particularly in the east. But to me, it doesn't appear just yet to have a material advantage to just overrun some of its targets. Forget Kiev and Kharkiv, but even Pokrovsk and some other key strongholds in the east. Like, we'll see what happens. But the Russians are pushing, and that deepens the Western involvement. You see that the administration has crossed one of its initial red lines of not to use US or West provided weapons to strike against Russia proper, and then Russia is trying to respond in kind. I think that Eric's description of Russia's foreign policy subordinated to the war in Ukraine is spot on. I also argue that it's now the organizing principle of Russian foreign policy. And if you look at every relationship that Russia has, basically it's assessed through the metrics of three key questions. What can this relationship bring to my battlefield success, to my military machine? How can this relationship be used to strengthen my embattled economy and provide new revenue streams, technology, and imports? And then three, and that's increasingly important, how can I use this relationship to make the West pay and feel the pain for support of Ukraine? If there would be Iraq or Afghanistan war, Russia would definitely be on the opposite side of the US, but there are no such wars. So Russia is desperately looking for this type of situations to help America's and Western adversaries in order for the US to feel the pain. And we may argue we don't have very good visibility into Moscow thinking, whether they genuinely believe that, oh, the Americans will kind of feel that it hurts because of what we're doing with Kim Jong-un, or that we threaten to supply weapons to the Houthis, and they will re-engineer their approach toward Ukraine and come to negotiation table and will find a solution. Or they understand that it's impossible, so they want to create as many pressure points and they increase the level of pain. So we don't know. Regardless, it's a very disruptive approach. And China is the country that checks all of the three boxes. It's very instrumental in helping the Russian military machine for the reasons that Liana outlined, the support through sending of dual-use goods, sharing of satellite imagery, and various other means. It's key to keep the Russian economy afloat. It's not the only one. There are India, there are countries in the Gulf. But China is really the massive enabler of Russian economy still rolling on steam. And then three, China is also something that Russia tries to instrumentalize because it's the largest adversary of the US. So the theory of the case in Moscow is that the stronger China gets, the sooner we will disrupt and impede the US unipolar moment, what's left of US hegemony, and then everybody will come to an eye level, and hopefully there will be a negotiated outcome of this, like a big Yalta. But if not, like the old world order will go in flames, and then something new will be reestablished where Russia plays a prominent role and sits at the table with the big guys. As long as that's the thinking in Moscow, partnership with China will be paramount for any leader for kind of keep Russia in the game and survive. And my concern is that, again, we don't know how this war and when this war is going to end, whether the end of the hot phase, shooting and destruction, will really end the confrontation, even if we get to some form of ceasefire, whether Vladimir Putin will be over or he will just try to use this pause to rearm and come back, and maybe come back in a different place. But this structural dependency sets in motion several trends that Russia's economic dependency with the West is unbuilt very rapidly. There will be soon nothing left from trade between Russia and the European Union, and bulk of Russia's trade, both exports and imports, will be with China. Russian financial system will be fully unionized. And then the element of the confrontation is also alienation of the Russian society. For various reasons, there are various European countries who have various policies, like Germany is the one that rolls out or tries to roll out red carpets to Russians like myself, but also many others. There are countries that just, make Russians coming to Europe or anywhere as complicated as possible. As a result, you will have Russian educated elite and population in whole estranged from the West for the first time in their history to a very significant degree, similar to the Cold War, but also very bitter. And thinking about the West as hypocritical, as not a good model, as, hating everything Russian. And Russians, both the elite and the population, are not naive. Like, they don't think that China is a benevolent friend that just wants to help Russia out. Everybody understands that China is in it for its own interest, but they see this asymmetric dependency as a far lesser challenge as being defeated in Ukraine. And I think that, unfortunately, in year 3 on this confrontation, we see that what started as Putin's war, supported by some sectors in the society and the elite, is increasingly becoming a Russia war, because people have died, the country has suffered, and it's just like very difficult to convince the Russians that, this course is just all about, Ukraine, and it's all about Putin, not you. So this confrontation just might create some very durable drivers in Russia's identity, economic orientation, and foreign policy thinking that might outlive Putin, although, again, the future is not defined. And I think that needs to be baked into the expectations. I share Liana's assessment that containment is perhaps the best way to go forward, where you don't go to war with Russia, which would be catastrophic. Like, you don't want to go to war with Russia, not on your terms, but at the same time just mitigates the risk. And very
I think we have a little bit of a freeze there on Sasha. I don't know if you're still with us and can hear us.
Yes, I can.
Good. Okay, you're back. You were just in your concluding thought and things froze up for a second.
My thought was that the containment will be not only about Russia, but will be about Russia, China, for a separate set of issues where China is really the centerpiece of the US concerns about how the international order will be structured in the 21st century. Like, it's a far bigger fish to fry than Russia. But since of this convergence between the two, I think that any long-term grand strategy should assume that the two, despite all of the frictions between them and like they're not 100% on one page on everything, they're more likely to be aligned and operate in tandem rather than not.
Okay. Sasha, let me also come back to the one aspect that Liana spoke about, which is in particular the position of the German government and the sustainability, the durability of the very tough policy toward Russia that Germany has taken, especially since February 2022. Do you share her view that this is still a mainstream consensus and is likely to continue? Do you see cracks in that edifice in any way? How do you perceive and assess the German position toward Russia?
With all of the established parties and political forces, and I think that AfD and Die Linke are an outcast at this point, we see a lot of consensus. The peace in Social Democrats campaigning is really meaning not peace with Russia, but a way to support Ukraine that doesn't expand the war and that doesn't get Germany involved into war with Russia. There is still this kind of wish to portray that, oh, we're just supporting Ukraine, we're not involved in fighting Russia, and that's why this war will not spread into NATO. That's at least what Scholz is trying to pitch and explain his decisions not to provide towers to Ukrainians. And other means where he says, like, we're therefore supporting of Ukraine, but we don't want to escalate and get into kind of sleepwalking trajectory to getting involved into this war. So I think that there are some disagreements around the tactics, like Christian Democrats favor transfer of towers and other sophisticated weaponry. The question is that the price that Europe will be paying for supporting Ukraine and building this containment over Russia, which will have a very significant military and deterrence element, will mount. And 2% of GDP expenditures will be just the floor. And I think that if you look at what happens at countries in the eastern flank, the Baltics, Finland, Poland, and others, they're ramping up their defense expenditures, and they want to create really credible deterrence for the Russians not to have any ideas, even if Vladimir Putin is kind of in a state where he thinks that a little adventure here and there, is something that helps him to break NATO, that he won't be able to do that. But that will come at a very significant cost, and that will come at a significant cost for the middle class. So the political leaders now have a task to explain to the population that we ask you to buy a very costly insurance from the risk that is very low probability at this point, like Russia really challenging Article 5 somewhere. But the more we procrastinate, the more we do some incremental stuff and so on, the more the tail risk of this kind of Russian aggression against NATO somewhere materializes and becomes increasingly likely. So we have to pay, and we have to tighten that belt amid very unfavorable economic conditions where cheap natural resources from Russia are gone, peace dividend is gone, and trade with China, like our hopes that there will be just giant expanding markets, particularly for German companies, is also gone because of the geopolitical and geoeconomic concerns. And then the US is also very protectionist, and our dream of more unified European market is also not very much materialized. So it's a tough call, but I think that all of the major parties are on the same page. The question is, what happens as this cost will start to mount? And the voices that say, oh, but there is a different path. Let's negotiate with the Russians. Let's give them part of Ukraine. All of that might sound appealing. So it's a big challenge for the policymakers on how to frame this policy as something rational and as a go-to strategy and discredit any kind of appeasement alternatives.
Right, right. Thank you. I see a number of questions popping up in the queue, so thank you to viewers who have already started to offer their contributions. I wanted to take one of those, and which is about Russia's investments in its military forces, including in its submarines. And as one questioner points out, we saw a Russian submarine in Havana recently. Is there a strategy behind this? Is this an attempt to sort of send a not so subtle message that Russia has friends in the Western Hemisphere? To what extent should that be taken seriously, or is that a distraction? I leave that open to any of the panelists. Maybe Eric, since as a former U.S. official, how do you think people might put that into context? These kinds of efforts by Russia to show that it has friendships in our neighborhood.
Yeah, I think it's largely a public relations exercise by Russia to kind of rattle the cages of the West, get headlines in the Miami Herald or whatever newspaper will print maybe alarmist headlines about this sort of activity. But more broadly, I think it speaks to kind of the militarization of Russian foreign policy. Their soft power is largely ebbing. They kind of go back to military shows of strength as kind of the go-to tool in their toolbox, and so that kind of more speaks to a weakness of Russian influence elsewhere. Their economy is being diverted to military efforts. Diplomatically, yes, they've kind of been more effective, certainly, than we would like, with the swing states throughout the world, and the fence sitters in advancing their narrative with Ukraine. But on the whole, the war in Ukraine has been full of setbacks for Russian diplomacy, especially in Europe and in the kind of OECD countries. But there's also, I think, a more serious aspect to Russia's militarization of their efforts to project influence, and that is like actual kinetic actions, in Western Europe, where they're using their intelligence network to sabotage transport lines, military factories. Again, they want to try to disrupt the flow of weapons to Ukraine most directly, but I think there's also an element of trying to accelerate what Sasha was talking about, the decay and disintegration of Western support for Ukraine, and to try to intensify the divisions within Western societies through their own prodding, in the information space, but also now in a more kinetic manner.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. Let me pick up another question, which is about it starts from the DPRK Russian agreement from just a couple of days ago. And in a larger context, you have Russia as a member of the so-called BRICS group. Also, you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other international formats where Russia has tried to expand its circle of friends and supporters. Do you see other formalized efforts taking shape, like the Russia DPRK agreement, in the future? Is this something we should expect to see Russian diplomacy trying to advance? Maybe to Liana or Sasha, if either of you wants to address that.
think that getting mutual military assistance pact
I think we may have a slow internet connection or some other interference. So while we wait for Sasha to come back to us, Liana, do you want to offer a view on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, picking up on what Sasha just said, sort of the military assistance pact between Russia and North Korea. I mean, first of all, that is something which obviously looks good on paper, but the question is, how much will it, how sort of sustainable is it actually in reality? And the greater challenge there in terms of the relationship is for me also, what does Putin conclude from his visit to North Korea for the own direction of his regime and his ideology? So in the past, it was pretty clear, even for Russia's domestic context, that North Korea is an outcast, right? I mean, it's like the most totalitarian state. It's an absurd state. It's a brutal state. It's a cruel state. And that this would certainly not be something that, a state Russia would want to have as an ally. And certainly also not as a state that, you want to copy domestically. And I think the question from me from this visit to some extent, what kind of impression did it make on Vladimir Putin? Was it sort of the same impression that it makes on us as being completely absurd? Or was it kind of tempting for him? Did it show him, well, this might be a little bit over the top, what he's doing, but it feels quite nice, all having all these kids with the sunflowers and so on. So I would not entirely exclude that one of the takeaways from his visit is, well, actually the North Korean regime might be not as bad as I thought, and the instruments that they use might perhaps not be as bad as I thought before. But yeah, I think Sasha is back and might want to end his thought on this.
By the way, I will turn to Sasha in a second. It reminds me of the piece that Stephen Kotkin had in Foreign Affairs just recently, in which he talks about the Russia's five futures, and one of those is Russia as a North Korea like state, which can't be attractive in Moscow, but the other options perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think we always thought about this sort of in terms of foreign policy terms, that Russia becomes sort of North Korea in foreign policy terms, but Russia can also sort of domestically, Putin might find it appealing what he saw in North Korea.
Back to you, Sasha.
I think that the Kim family is all the time cosplaying Joseph Stalin. So you don't need to seek inspiration in North Korea, where you can get that sitting in the Kremlin in your own history. And Stalin, unfortunately, comes the closest, particularly since the lot of this rethinking and reportrayal of Stalin. We know that the tragedy is that Putin is an amateur historian. He spends a lot of time reading history, obviously, and goes into archives and so on. And his view of this period is the one that legitimizes Iosif Vissarionovich to an extent, although we hope that.
Right. Thank you, Sasha. I see another question, which is about the requirements of a containment strategy. A European deterrence capability would be essential, and so question, perhaps in particular to you, Liana, what would it take to make European deterrence of Russia credible?
I think the first step is obviously conventional deterrence, and there Europeans need to invest much more. I mean, on defense spending, it is good that 23 countries are now meeting the 2% target or exceeding the 2% target for the NATO summit. On average, non-US allies are meeting the 2% target, so that's great. But that means that we need to move beyond 2%, because for Europe sort of to build up credible conventional deterrence towards Russia, and they need to invest more than 2% in their own militaries. The other part of that is building up Europe's defense industrial base. The question is, to what extent will this take place in cooperation with the United States, or to some extent, perhaps also at the expense of United States industry? which is a key point of discussion between Paris and Germany at this point in time. And the other question is sort of how to make European armies complementary with each other, how to fill the gaps that European armies have where they rely on the United States, for example, on airlift capabilities. And then perhaps the last aspect, or two last aspects. One is manpower. So conscription is coming back as a model to Europe. Germany is discussing a version of conscription. So how do you get the manpower? How do you get, for example, in the case of Germany, an army of 205,000, whereas you only now have 185,000? Where do you get these additional soldiers? And then the other part is Europe has been very good, and European sort of defense industry has been very good in making this kind of exquisite projects with sort of very fancy weaponry, which is designed specifically for the needs of this one army. European defense industry and European militaries need to go back also to the basics, producing ammunition in big amounts, instead of producing this one fancy helicopter version that is particularly needed for just the German army. And I think those are the sort of challenges in building up European defense conventionally. And sort of non-conventionally case on the sort of nuclear equation, that is going to be much more difficult. And I think that's the biggest open question. If Trump returns, if he challenges Europeans, because the conventional part you can build up in perhaps a decade. If you increase defense spending significantly, you still need to train and know how to use those weapons. But the nuclear part is going to be much more challenging. It's much more challenging than just saying, well, you know, then we will just extend the French and the UK umbrella over the rest of Europe, because there are not many Europeans that actually trust France, and especially not if we see sort of those far right-wing gains in France. And just sort of the level of deterrence, it's just very different with the UK and French umbrella than the strategic stability between the United States and Russia. So that's deterrence on a conventional level. It's easier for Europeans to build up. Deterrence sort of on the nuclear level is a whole other question.
Yeah.
Eric, I can just add, I think Liana's summary of the military side of this is spot on. I think Europe also needs to draw lessons from countries like Finland, which talk about comprehensive deterrence, which means their societies, you know, recognize the other threats that Russia poses in terms of information operations, cyber, you know, energy security, economic security writ large. And I think it requires European and American leaders to do some of the things that Liana and Michael talked about in their article, that, you know, recognize this is going to be a decades-long challenge, and we have to, you know, kind of rewind our mental clocks back to the 1930s and look at how we were able to deal with the totalitarian challenge that emerged, you know, from the Nazi Germany at that stage. So, you know, and this requires, I think, you know, Liana mentioned the idea that, you know, nobody wants to campaign on a slogan of, you know, get ready for war, but you know, as Trotsky didn't say, but it's attributed to him, you know, war, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And if you look at how the Russian narrative is that they are at war with us, and you know, we can't just be in denial any longer, and we have to you know, not be alarmist, but we have to take it seriously, and that requires resources and a real kind of shift in how our leaders talk about this.
Yeah, I want to pose the last question to Sasha, which will be about China and its views of Russia. But before I do that, I want to pick up on one of the questions in the queue, and I want to pose to Eric, because it's a question about essentially differing nuances or differing approaches to questions within Western governments about things like sanctions. And of course, in Brussels recently, there was some disagreement about how comprehensive to make the tightening of the sanctions with regard to gas, for example. As a former U.S. policymaker, to what degree are those kinds of divergences or maybe a slight assonance, an annoyance, a cause for deeper concern? How do you kind of assess and place in kind of a context those kinds of difficult negotiations among allies?
Yeah, I think the overarching headline is pretty good news on a strategic level. There's broad agreement. We want to limit Russia's ability to supply its defense industry. We want to limit the revenues that they derive from their energy exports. But at the same time, we also want to maintain stability in these world energy markets. And this, of course, is an area where Russia plays a big role. So we want to slowly, we want to reduce their revenues through things like the oil price cap. And we want to erode Russia's role in the market overall over time. So the issues, the differences are really more about tactics, and countries have legitimate concerns about rapid disruptions to their supplies of energy. For example, they may have a national champion that has a certain dependence on something that has a nexus with Russia. But I think the overall trend is that there's a strategic alignment, and we want to maintain that as much as possible. But yeah, of course, every time you have a G7 summit, you start out with often maybe the US and the British kind of pushing for something a little more heavy duty, and then there's a lot of differences of view. But on some issues, it's not always predictable where countries will come out. So yeah, it's a challenge, but so far I think we've been able to. Our motto at the beginning of the war was to start high and stay high with the sanctions, and there's always an element of whack-a-mole and trying to plug holes because the Russians are actively trying to evade the sanctions as fast as we come up with them. So it's a work in progress, and it always will be.
Okay. There's too many insights to try to encapsulate them all as I sum up. But one of the things that really struck me, I think, Eric, you made the point that for the United States, essentially, Russia policy is Ukraine policy. And Sasha, you made the equally pertinent point, which is more easily overlooked, I think, from a U.S. perspective, that the same holds true, and perhaps even more so for Russia, that everything else is subordinated in foreign policy terms to the war in Ukraine. What is your assessment of how that looks from a Chinese perspective? You touch upon this in your foreign affairs piece, but maybe just as a concluding thought for us to have a view on the Chinese perspective of the opportunities that are opened up by this confrontation between Russia and the West.
First of all, I think that the U.S. is pretty right about how the Russian leadership looks at the war in Ukraine. And I think that it's a ton of very sophisticated, capable people. It's great that Eric is a colleague at Carnegie now, but I think that there are a lot of very smart, knowledgeable colleagues about Russia. On China, as we say that Russia looks everything through its lens of competition and confrontation with the US, so does China. China believes that it's imposed on them by the Americans, that no matter whether there are Republicans or Democrats in the White House, the US is out to get them because they don't want China to compete and to be able to stand as a towering presence in the global economy, in the tech landscape, and militarily in Asia and globally. So here, China is a very lonely superpower. US power largely relies on a network of very resourceful allies that are pushed towards the US by convergence of values and interests. China doesn't have anything resembling that. And Russia came as the closest they could have for a resourceful partner that brings natural resources through kind of land-based routes that are more secure than maritime, that is a market for China, not the market, but still a market. It has significant nuclear power that will distract the US when the two nuclear peers stand back to back towards each other facing the US. That puts a lot of pressure on the US on how do you expand your force and build the force to contain both simultaneously, and just for even conventionally for force planners, if Russia does something like a large exercise, scary exercise next to the Baltics that is on brink of doing something more dangerous, and then China exercises in Taiwan, what does it mean? So I think that for them, with all of the unpredictability, just too much risk appetite that Putin demonstrates to their taste, there is still no other Russia than Russia in terms of Chinese foreign policy goals.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that is a great place for us to wrap up. I want to thank Liana Fix, Sasha Gabuev, Eric Green for being with us today for this webinar and for sharing your insights, which has really, I think, been an enriching experience for us, and we're proud to have had you with us. I want to thank our viewers for being with us and for asking some great questions. And to all of you, wish you all the best. Have a good weekend, and we look forward to being back in touch again soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to talk to you.
Same here.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Thank you, everyone.